The Oort Perimeter, Chapter 2. Sir, incoming message from Command 1. It's for you, said the operations officer. Put it through, replied Mike. A small, holographic display screen appeared in front of him, on which was the image of an older, dark-skinned man. Grand Admiral, this is Commander Fritz, acting duty officer for Oort Perimeter Control. Our long-range sensors are detecting the approach of several warp signatures. They appear to be Sirian in origin. Exact class and ship type are currently unknown. But, whatever they are, they appear to be fairly well proportioned, said the man. Battle cruisers? Asked Mike. I don't know for certain, sir, but I would say that's a reasonable assumption. Understood. Hail them as usual when they arrive, and advise them that no warship may pass through the Oort Perimeter. If their diplomatic ships needs an escort, we'll provide it for them. Understood, Sir. Fritz out. The image soon shimmered, and then vanished. A tall, beefy, middle-aged lieutenant commander soon turned around in his chair and stared at Mike curiously. Well proportioned, eh? I wonder what kind of ships they brought with them as escorts, he said with an Australian accent. If I didn't know any better, I'd say they're coming with a group of 8 REM-KAL light battleships, said Mike. The officer perked up in surprise. 8? That's an awful lot of firepower for a diplomatic escort. Given their history, and suspected ties to the Juna Mafia, it's understandable that they'd want the extra protection, said Mike. Ah, that makes sense, as the Juna are nasty little blighters if you ask me. Mike chuckled. True, but they're also why we're here today. Without their interference years ago we'd probably still be exploring the galaxy at sublight, or at least very elementary FTL. The man chuckled. Indeed we would be, sir, he replied. Slowing to sublight, said Pendleton. Mike turned to his right, and said to his operations officer, Martin, what's the status of the Sirian diplomatic fleet? The officer fiddled with her control panel for several moments, and then said, It appears they'll be arriving in approximately 8 minutes, sir. Sydney, what'd be the tactical risk to our ship if we went out to the Oort Perimeter and greeted our guests personally? Asked Mike. The lieutenant commander furrowed his brow. You actually want to go out and greet these people, in this ship? He asked. Mike nodded. The lieutenant frowned. Far be it for me to disagree, sir, but I believe that such an action would put you at too great a risk, he said. Eric Rogers, the chief engineer, looked up from his station behind Mike, and said, I have to agree with him, sir. We're one of the biggest targets in the fleet. And, while we're certainly one of the most durable ships around, we're not invincible. I'm not saying that they're planning to do anything crazy, like assassinate you, but why take the risk? Mike chuckled. I understand that, Eric, but I wasn't planning on greeting them outside the perimeter. As you said, I'd be silly to put us at risk like that. Instead, I was thinking that we could greet them inside the perimeter when they pass through. Especially if they're entering with just their diplomatic yachts. Well, that does sound better. Commander, is that okay with you? Asked Sydney. Eric shrugged. It's fine with me, just so long as we don't scratch the hull while rubbing shoulders with them. I just put a fresh coat of paint on it yesterday, he quipped. This made everyone chuckle. Mike then turned his attention towards the front of the ship, and nodded at the helm. All right, Mr. Pendleton, take us out to the rendezvous point, he said. Aye, sir. Nordham looked up as one of his assistants walked in. Sir, you requested to know when Grand Admiral Clayton arrived, said the assistant. I take it he's here? Asked Nordham. The assistant nodded slightly. Well, yes, and also no. Nordham looked at the assistant curiously. What do you mean, yes and no? Well, he was coming here in the Sir Genius, which arrived several moments ago. But then he continued on towards the Oort Perimeter, Gate 27. Nordham blinked in surprise. He what? He exclaimed. Yes, sir, he's reportedly heading out there to meet up with the Sirian diplomatic vessels when they arrive. Good gods! Why is he doing that? Hail his ship and tell him to get back here immediately. Yes, sir. Mike sat in his chair as he studied the holographic command display that floated in front of him, and the myriad of information displayed on it. "Wow, now that's an impressive sight," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "It is indeed, sir, but I think your guess on the type of ships they'd bring was wrong," said Eric. Mike chuckled. "Well, I was partially right. They do have 2 REM-KAL battleships with them. But the other 6 I'm unfamiliar with." "Sydney, do you know what those are?" he asked. Sydney's fingers danced lightly across his tactical console, quickly filling his displays with a multitude of information. "Well, 2 of the ships are of a design we've never seen before. They appear to be some type of cruiser that's flying support for their big hitters. The other 4 are Miyago-class destroyers. Less than half the firepower of the REM-KAL, but easily 3 times more maneuverable. Interesting. 4 heavy hitters for the big stuff, and 4 sprinters for the little stuff. That's a respectable lineup for an escort fleet," said Mike. Pendleton snorted. "I've seen better." Mike grinned. "What makes you say that, Lieutenant?" he asked. Pendleton turned around in his chair, and said, "REM-KAL battleships maneuver like a rock. Apparently the designers thought that firepower was more important than speed or maneuverability. And it doesn't help any that their flight systems are so pathetically underpowered that it's laughable. Especially for a ship that size. It's like putting an 80-pound suit of armor on a 10-year-old kid." Mike gave a whimsical grin. "What about their destroyers?" he asked. Pendleton screwed up his face in an expression of sarcastic disdain, but said nothing. Mike and Sydney laughed. "No comment, eh? Well, then I guess we have nothing to really worry about from any of their ships then, do we?" said Mike. "Well, given the firepower we have, I don't see them as being much of a concern. Besides, I'd like to see them butt heads with one of our dreadnoughts. That'd be an experience they'd never forget, assuming they survived," said Sydney. The others chuckled. "I think they'd have more to worry about from our ship killers than our dreadnoughts, if you ask me," quipped Martin. "Yeah, they probably would. That's why I like our ship killers so much. Lots of firepower in a small package," said Mike. Just then Martin's console beeped. It was an incoming message. "Admiral, the Chancellor's assistant is hailing us. The Chancellor wants us to report back to Pluto Station immediately," she said. Mike furrowed his brow slightly. "How soon will the ambassador's ship be through the barrier?" he asked. "Not sure, sir. Let me find out," said Martin. She flew across her operations console and quickly found the information she needed. "Ah, here we go. Perimeter Control is reporting that they've cleared the ambassador's ship for entry and will be allowing them through shortly." "Excellent. Mr. Pendleton, please put us into position to meet the ambassador's ship as soon as it comes through," said Mike. Pendleton grinned slightly. "Ah, sir? Not to be nitpicky or anything, but the Chancellor did request that we return to Pluto Station immediately. It's obvious that they know we've received their message, so faking a communications problem, or some other technical difficulty, is out of the question. Especially given Commander Rogers' spotless, and almost overzealous maintenance record. That leads me to believe that you have a really good reason for ignoring his orders," he said. Mike smiled. "Excellent observation, Lieutenant. Yes, I have 2 reasons for doing that. The first is that I want to give Eric a chance to put our new sensor array through its paces, checking over the Syrian ships for possible contraband and spying equipment as they enter. The second is that I want to pretend like we're offering the new diplomats an added political courtesy upon their arrival to Sol Space. Doing that should help grease the wheels of diplomacy. I appreciate the opportunity to try out our newest toys, sir, but wouldn't they expect something like that?" asked Eric. "They would. But they'll also be expecting to face our older sensor systems, not our newer ones. Sounds logical enough. And besides, I've been looking forward to giving those upgrades a good shakedown anyways." Mike chuckled. "I thought you might." The ship soon reached the Oort Perimeter, a massive defensive shield barrier that surrounded the entirety of Seoul, and then stopped to await their guests. The Oort Perimeter had been given its name in honor of Dr. Oort, a famous Dutch astronomer, who proposed a theory years earlier that a massive cloud of comets and other space debris existed beyond the edge of our solar system, and surrounded it like a gigantic sphere. Since everyone in the society knew that his theoretical Oort cloud didn't actually exist, many had laughed him to scorn when they'd first heard his theory. But it was an ingenious young engineer, one of the pioneers of the perimeter shield system, who'd ultimately turned Dr. Oort's folly into reality, if only in part, by naming the newly completed defensive barrier, the Oort Perimeter, in honor of him. The Kuiper Perimeter, a secondary defensive grid similar to the Oort Perimeter, which protected the 9 planets of Sol and resided just beyond the orbit of Pluto, was also named in much the same way. It was these 2 massive spherical shield arrays that provided most of the first-line defense for Sol space, and made it much easier for Earthfleet to do its primary job, that of defending all of humanity, by keeping out anyone or anything that might threaten Earth. What also helped to keep Sol space safe was that many within the galaxy believed the 2 perimeters to be impenetrable. This illusion was kept alive by the fact that only a handful knew of their true weaknesses. And it was these weaknesses that had prompted Mike to begin a program of system-wide upgrades to both perimeters several years earlier, beginning with the Oort Perimeter. This was being done by replacing each of the original defensive shield satellites with newer, more advanced, and more powerful models. Progress on the upgrades had gone quickly, leaving only a few areas of the Oort Perimeter where the work was still incomplete. But, given enough time, even those would be replaced, and the new barrier would be truly impenetrable, giving Earthfleet the one thing it had desired for many years, a certainty that Earth would be safe from any and all possible harm originating from outside the system. After that, they would begin work on upgrading the Kuiper Perimeter as well. Once that was completed, the only thing they'd have to worry about then would be threats from within, such as Black Orchid, the Illuminati, and even mankind itself to some degree. Mike watched as the Sergenius pulled up to access Gate 27 and came to a stop. It was a long-standing Earthfleet rule that everyone, from the highest-ranking dignitaries to the lowliest merchants, had to pass through this gate. This applied even if they were merely headed to Pluto Station, an oddity in its own right, as it was the only station in all of Sol space that operated outside the Kuiper Perimeter. But that didn't mean it was any less important than any other station under Earthfleet, or the Society's control. And it was anything but the dingy, run-down rat hole that most trading posts were. Instead, it was kept in pristine condition, and was, in plain fact, one of the nicest trading and diplomatic posts in the entire region. This was because Pluto Station served as a representative of Earth and all she had to offer. So the Society and the fleet went to great lengths to make and keep her as beautiful, practical, safe and clean as humanly possible. And all that attention to detail showed. As Pendleton peered through the front window of the ship, a gentle smirk crossed his face. "I see our guests are fashionably late. I would have expected them to be here by now," he muttered. Just then a series of blue and red navigation lights began flashing along the length of the gate passage, denoting the route the Syrian ship would be required to take through the numerous layers of the shield. Pendleton watched curiously as the gate shields vanish one by one, and then immediately reappear moments later. This intrigued him. "What in the world is that?" he asked. "What do you see?" asked Mike. "The shields are doing something weird. They seem to be switching on and off in sequence, like a line of lights on a marquee or something," replied Pendleton. Mike smiled. "I take it you've never seen the gate open before?" he asked. "No, sir, never had a need to." "Ah, then that would explain why you're unfamiliar with its operating protocols." Pendleton spun in his chair and stared curiously at Mike. "Operating protocols, sir," he said. "What the Admiral is referring to is the method by which the gates in the perimeter are opened and closed to allow ships through. The distance between each shield level in the perimeter is approximately 1 kilometer, give or take a few dozen meters to form an actual gate. One grid in each level of the shield has been designated as one of the doors for the gateway. In order to let ships in or out, each grid is switched off to allow a ship through and then switched back on after it passes. Only one grid can be switched off at a time, hence the strange activity you're seeing in the shield array," said Eric. What in the blazes do they need to do that for? Asked Pendleton. It's designed to help us control what gets in or out by isolating anything that comes through the gate, giving us time to scan for unwanted intruders, or contraband, as they enter or leave. And, if we find anything, the ships have nowhere to go, and thus are easily detained, boarded, and searched if need be. So it's kinda like a turnstile at a subway, only with shield layers, right? Something like that. Well, that's a silly way to do things. With the sensor systems we have, we ought to be able to catch whoever comes through that gate, cloaked or otherwise, without having to resort to such crazy methods of filtering. True, but it's also done that way to allow for the slow regeneration time of the shield grids. Given how long they take to reform, if we did spot something suspicious as they were passing through, we wouldn't be able to raise the shield in time to keep them out, or in. Hence why things are done this way. Plus, the slower transit speed of the ships produces a significantly smaller ion trail, thus making it much harder for cloaked ships to sneak through the gate by hiding in the ion wake left behind by another ship. Pendleton smirked. Sounds silly to me, but hey, whatever floats your boat, he said. Sir, the Syrian diplomatic transport is through the gate, said Martin. Are our standard escort ships in place? Asked Mike. Aye, sir. Mike nodded. All right, Mr. Pendleton, join up in formation with the escort ships. Ms. Martin, hail the escort leader and inform them that we'll be joining them for the flight into Pluto Station, and then hail the Syrian ship and tell them we'll be helping escort them to the station. Make sure they know I'm aboard. Aye, sir, said both crewmen. The Sergenius soon joined up with the diplomatic transport as the small formation began making its way to Pluto Station. As they did, Mike dismissed his holographic command display, and then turned and looked at Eric. Can you begin passive scanning of the Syrian ship? He asked. Been doing that since we left the perimeter, sir, said Eric. Anything? Eric shook his head. Unless Lieutenant Martin has seen something, the Syrian ship is squeaky clean. Mike turned around, and said, Lieutenant? I'm seeing nothing out of the ordinary, sir. If they're hiding something, we're not seeing it. I can go active if you'd like, said Martin. Not right now. We'll do that later on once the diplomats are on the station. I don't want to offend them before we can, at least, have our first meeting. Martin nodded. Understood, sir.